I Love My Teacher's Guts by Dr. Paul McNamara. In a rather ordinary and boring school, something extraordinary was about to happen. Sally and the rest of her class watched as Mrs. Trump prepared a special chemistry lesson. "Children," said Mrs. Trump, "when these special chemicals are mixed together, they will cause a memorable explosion. Stand back, everyone. A lot of heat and energy is going to be released." Sally sneaked to the side of the room to get a better view. With a mix of green and a hue of blue, the bubbling liquid grew and grew. The potion started to fizz, then sizzle, then kaboom! An explosion filled the whole room with gas and smoke. Most of the class dived for cover under their desks, but Sally was propelled through the air like a rocket. As she tumbled through the smoke, she began to feel odd. She began to fizzle and crackle until, flash, she shrank to the size of a microscopic particle and shot towards her teacher's face. Sally went straight into Mrs. Trump's nose, flying through some of her nose hairs, and got stuck in a web of thick green snot. "Yuck," said Sally. "Teacher snot." Sally tried to climb out of Mrs. Trump's nostril, but the snot blocked her exit. "It's no good. I'm going to have to travel through Mrs. Trump," thought Sally. With a hop, skip, and a jump, she slid into Mrs. Trump's esophagus, the tube that moves food from Mrs. Trump's mouth to her stomach, and from there she plummeted downwards until... Splash! The stomach is where Mrs. Trump digests her food, thought Sally. "I can't hang around in this acid for long, or I'll be liquefied." Floating in the green, gurgling liquid was Mrs. Trump's breakfast, a Cheerio ring. "Perfect," thought Sally. She climbed on and rode the waves towards the beginning of the small intestines. Sally surfed the acid sea along the winding 7-meter-long tube that was breaking down Mrs. Trump's food into vitamins, minerals, and proteins. All these elements would help her body cells grow and stay healthy. Up ahead were millions of tiny structures swaying in Mrs. Trump's intestines, like blades of seaweed in the ocean. "I know what these are. They're called villi," said Sally. The tiny villi tickled Sally and transported her from Mrs. Trump's intestines into her blood vessels. That was a tight squeeze, thought Sally. Once inside the blood vessels, she had to dodge hundreds of red and white blood cells that were whooshing past her at great speed. "That just missed taking my head off," screamed Sally, patting herself down to check she was still in one piece. Mrs. Trump's red blood cells carry oxygen around her body, while her white blood cells are part of her immune system and help to fight germs called viruses and bacteria. The white cells start to surround Sally. "I'm under attack," she thought. Mrs. Trump's body was treating Sally like an unwelcome guest. "I'm not meant to be here," said Sally. "Mrs. Trump body thinks I'm the coronavirus. I have to get out of here." "They're going to swallow me whole," said Sally as a white cell tried to munch her shoe. "Kick, kick, take that, you menace," Sally yelled as she broke free. "I need to get out of here." She grabbed onto a passing red cell and clung on for dear life. "Woohoo! This is better than my favorite funfair flume," said Sally as she sped through Mrs. Trump's bloodstream. "What is that swishing noise?" she wondered. Swish, swish, swish. "I'm headed for Mrs. Trump's liver." The liver is the largest organ in Mrs. Trump's body, and it works like a busy factory, processing the nutrients in her blood and filtering any waste. "I feel all shiny and new," thought Sally as she left Mrs. Trump's liver. With a newfound energy and determination to escape, she raced towards Mrs. Trump's heart. "Does grumpy old Mrs. Trump have a heart?" thought Sally. "It's probably made of stone." "Only one way to find out," she said as she sped on. As she got closer, she could hear lub-dub, 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 the unmistakable sounds of heart valves opening and closing. Mrs. Trump's heart acts like a magnificent muscular pump that sends blood all around her body and delivers oxygen to her cells. "She does have a heart after all," thought Sally. Sally shot through the chambers of Mrs. Trump's heart and into her lungs. This is where breathing takes place. Mrs. Trump's lungs looked like big pink tree branches with bunches of grapes on them. Sally grabbed hold of a newly oxygenated red cell, which took her right through the lungs. Next up would be Mrs. Trump's guts. She makes is injected from her body. In Mrs. Trump's dark, cavernous colon, Sally was overcome by a stifling stench. "What is that disgusting smell?" said Sally, pinching her nose. "Yuck, teacher poo." Sally leapt up and over the smelly excrement. Suddenly, she heard a rumble. The colon started to wiggle, making Sally do a little jig. Without warning, there was a gigantic gurgle and Trump. "I wish Mrs. Trump, you know what they say, beans good for your heart, but the more you eat, the more you fart." Sally shot out of Mrs. Trump's butt and immediately started to fizzle and crackle and grow back to her normal size. Sally wiped herself down and said, "That's one science lesson I won't forget in a hurry."